Hello everyone, sorry for the delay. Welcome to this webinar to mark the publication of Strategic Communication in a Post-Truth World, a special edition in March that was edited by Alistair Reid, guest editor. It's available online for all RUSI members and you're all very welcome. I'm delighted to chair this session and I'm very grateful to Emma De Angelis and Edward Mortimer for inviting me to chair it. We have a great lineup, so I'll just briefly introduce everyone. Before I do that, just some housekeeping rules. The event is being live streamed on Twitter, on YouTube and on Facebook, but for questions, please just use the Q&A on Zoom. That's the only method for asking questions. And I think that's mainly it. So just to move on to introducing our great panel, we have Donald Holbrook, who's Honorary Senior Research Associate, Department of Security and Crime Science, UCL, and Associate Fellow, International Center for Counter Terrorism, The Hague. He's worked very much on beliefs and ideas in the context of terrorism and political violence and published prolifically in that area. We have Claire Yorke, Henry A. Kissinger Postdoctoral Fellow, Jackson Institute, Yale. She works in the area of emotions and empathy in international affairs and diplomacy, and again, works and publishes in that area. And finally, we have Haroro Ingram, Research Fellow with the Coral Bell School, Australian National University, looking at the role of propaganda in strategies of violent non-state political movements. And he is also an Associate Fellow in the International Center for Counter Terrorism in The Hague. So welcome to you all. Each speaker will speak for 5 minutes and then we'll move, or 7 minutes, and then we'll move to questions and answers, and I'll kick that off. So thank you, everybody. We'll start with Donald.
Thank you very much, Etain. What I want to do is just to give you a very brief kind of overview of the paper that I wrote, which I titled The Challenge of Conspiracy Theories for Strategic Communication. The purpose of the paper was to give an overview of conspiracy theory for StratComms, to talk about what conspiracy theories have in common, to try to understand very broadly their appeal and the challenges inherent in trying to combat them. Now, obviously, the paper was written before COVID, before the situation in which we now find ourselves, where arguably these issues are center stage. I guess the key takeaway from the paper is that because conspiracy theories are so widespread, they not only risk poisoning public discourse in their own right, but also mainstreaming extremist ideas, and there are roles to play there for extremist organizations and disinformation campaigns and efforts of various types. And at the same time, as I mentioned, responding to these threats is inherently fraught with difficulty. We can define conspiracy theories as proposed explanations for events based on secretive plots of powerful agents. And we can talk about 5 key ingredients that conspiracy theories tend to have in common. First of all is this notion of deliberate intent. So nothing happens by accident, things happen by design, which is very important because that means we have somebody to blame. Let me just start my video. Sorry about that. The second point is this sense of direct line of control. Conspiracy theories assume high levels of agency. There's this notion that governments are competent, all-powerful and strong and capable of retaining secrets. Much in ways that we know that they can't. Third is this notion of secrecy and deception. So the plots behind conspiracies are hidden and the truths that expose them are hidden as well and available only to the chosen few. And then the fourth dimension is this element of interconnectedness. So nothing happens in isolation. Everything is connected, things are linked. And then the fifth point is this sense of large-scale complicity. So blame is holistic, it isn't narrow, it isn't attached to a set of individuals, it is assigned to communities and much broader things. And then if we move on to think about why conspiracy theories appeal to people, again, there are 5 key things that we can think about. First of all, is a general sense of lack of trust in government institutions, a sense of powerlessness and alienation in communities. Second is a general sense of unhappiness with our situation, whether that's for socioeconomic reasons or other reasons. Thirdly, there's an environment where secrecy or myths about alternatives is common. We can touch upon that in the Q&A. The fourth reason is limited access to information sources, either structurally or voluntarily. And again, we can talk about that in the Q&A as well. And then the final point, which I think is particularly important in this situation we now find, is the explanatory power of conspiracy theories. Believing in conspiracy theories can be very satisfying because they explain everything, and the alternatives tend to be much weaker. So I think this touches upon issues such as rationality as well. It can be an entirely rational thing, given the context, given our circumstances, to be attracted to conspiracy theories, particularly in times of crisis and turmoil because of their explanatory power. What can we do about them? Countering conspiracy theories directly is notoriously difficult. They have what's often referred to as a self-sealing quality, which means that outside efforts to try and undermine them are part or seen as part of the original conspiracy. There's this common refrain that you would say that, wouldn't you, because you're trying to protect vested interests of the elite. And then again, as is mentioned before, alternative explanations that events have complex causes, that the world out there is messy and often hard to explain, tends to be a weaker explanation than the one offered by conspiracy theories. So what I think we need to do and we need to think about when we're considering our approach to conspiracy theories and the need to counter them in some ways is to think about these 5 reasons that I talked about for their appeal, particularly in the way in which people now go about sourcing their news, particularly about the way in which our information environment has changed, and about the way in which we use the internet and things like the growth of internet subcultures, which again, I think is something we can touch about the Q&A. But that's just a very brief overview of the paper where hopefully I've brought out the key points. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Donald. It's intriguing. I think there'll be lots of questions. So next we move to Haroro. And I should add, he is also Senior Research Fellow in the Programme on Extremism at George Washington University.
Well, first, I'd like to start by, of course, thanking my fellow panelists and Etain for hosting, and of course to Alistair Reid, who is the editor for this special issue. And so again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk through the paper today and kind of get into the Q&A. I thought I'd start by maybe just providing a bit of a background to the article. The research that kind of informed the article, it started in about 2015, 2016, and it emerged from these policy discussions that I was having in different kind of places in the EU, especially in the Netherlands, but also in the UK. In the US and Australia. And it was this recurring issue, this recurring question of how can we understand this range of state and non-state malign, kind of have on one end of the spectrum non-state actors, violent extremists, for example, and on the other end of the spectrum, you of course have states such as China and Russia. This complex middle between these two spectrums of varying degrees of coordination and kind of synchronicity, whether it occurs on purpose or just due to kind of shared adversaries. And so there was this recurring issue of, how do we kind of think about this spectrum of threats? And how can we shape the way that we think about these threats, keeping in mind that understanding shapes response, that the way in which these threats are understood is going to kind of shape the response. And so really kind of thinking through the implications for kind of posture and preparedness issues. There is a tendency, I saw it myself, whether it was working in counter-terrorism operations where I started my career, to working in preparedness in the Department of Defense. There's this tendency to silo threats, to kind of say, well, this is this kind of threat, and we need to channel resources and expertise and understanding other kind of threats over here. And there are a range of reasons why soloing is really important, or at least expertise in certain areas and a specific focus. But at the same time, there can be problems with kind of maximizing the efficiency of your resource allocations, of your kind of focus. There is a tendency when you narrow your focus to certain threats, the blinders are up to other threats. And I think that there are very few people who would make the argument that isn't what kind of has occurred over the last few years, where there's been such a focus on the violent extremist threat that for the most part, these larger state-based threats had kind of been able to evolve, not completely unchallenged, that would be wrong, but sufficiently kind of insufficiently challenged. And so a big part of, I guess, this research was the need to not only develop an understanding of this spectrum of threats, but to ensure that that understanding would synchronize with other broader national security, foreign policy, and even public policy objectives. And so the RUSI article was kind of an opportunity for me to kind of first lay out this framework, and it's since kind of appeared in other publications that have kind of applied it more specifically. But the purpose of the RUSI article was basically to kind of lay out this framework, and what I proposed in the paper was to understand this spectrum of threats by this overarching kind of strategic logic, this shared strategic logic. And I kind of describe this spectrum of threats as anti-democratic influence threats. And I argue that malign influence activities, propaganda and disinformation, that target democracies by both state and non-state actors, that it tends to be characterized by this shared logic, which is to erode what I talk about in the paper as a trinity of trusts, and that these influence activities are designed to erode that trinity of trust. And it just seems that that trinity of trust is crucial for a democracy to function. So what are those kind of three trusts? Well, the first is social trust, which kind of trust between different groups within society. Trust in authorities and expertise. I thought that this topic was very well covered by a RAND report called Truth Decay. And the third is trust in democracy. And so when you look at non-state activities, state activities, malign influence activities, and I look at some different examples, you can see that, yes, there are these clear kind of short-term operational goals. But when you place those activities into this broader context, what you see is the way in which, for example, when, for example, Russian Kremlin-linked disinformation activities are inflaming tensions between protest groups, oppositional protest groups. That's a great example of an activity that is designed to erode social trust. The claims of violent extremist propagandists that you know, whether it is white supremacists who are seeking to drive a wedge on the basis of race between different populations in a democracy. You can see it in propaganda and disinformation activities targeting trust in authorities and expertise theories. Anti-vaxxer activities, these types of things are amplified by bots. When the state media operating in places like, you know, for example, China, that they are kind of highlighting stories of the corruption of officials, scientists, and experts. We've seen a lot of those activities during the coronavirus trust in democracy, and how those activities are designed to erode that crucial third trust. Well, there is no better example of that than election interference activities. We've also seen the propaganda rhetoric that has been designed to highlight those say-do gaps between the promises of democracy and the supposed reality. And it doesn't matter whether that's from non-state actors or state actors, that say-do gap between the supposed promises of democracy and how that is manifested in reality has been a really kind of crucial lever in these types of anti-democratic malign influence. And it kind of touches upon a really important point, which I hope we'll explore more in the Q&A and in the discussion, which is that the greatest wounds to democracy have tended to be self-inflicted. And what our adversaries have tended to do is then exploit those, to use that as leverage for malign influence activities. What's important about this framework is that its focus is more so on the medium to long-term effects of malign influence activities. And so I would hope that it is complementary to the very important libraries worth of research that has been done on propaganda and disinformation activities, conspiracy theory research that has been done, that's looked at the more immediate goals of these activities, whether it's to violence or to recruit for a particular purpose. But what I really wanted to focus on were these larger impacts upon, and I know Claire's going to talk about the atmospherics very, very soon. Well, I was kind of interested in that, the kind of impact that exposure to these types of activities over a period of time has on those dynamics. And so I talk about this set of psychosocial and strategic effects. And I argue that the psychosocial impact of populations is an increase in the population's susceptibility to kind of polarizing narratives, that these polarizing in-group, out-group, black and white kind of narratives. And that kind of emerged not just from great attraction and resonance from non-state actors that are engaged in that type of rhetoric and propaganda, but by state actors, for instance, populists. And there is this strategic effect, the strategic impact of these activities that's also important. And it's that as this trinity is eroded, it undermines the population's trust and engagement in democracy. And that can lead to support for or engagement in non-democratic forms of government or actions in support of a foreign power. And I think that there are some really concerning trends within democracies for the last few years that perhaps are seeing these dynamics playing out. Now, I want to conclude by making this one kind of final, again, overarching point, is that this is a particularly vulnerable time for democracies. We're in the middle of a long democratic recession. Since about 2005-06, both the number of democracies and the freedoms within democracies have been on this slide. And that trend for the last, what was it, 15 or so years, 14, 15 years, is in stark contrast for the 30 years that preceded that, where from 1975 to 2005-06, you have this increase in the number of democracies and the freedoms. And that contrast is really striking. And this democratic recession, it is precisely the kind of conditions which anti-democratic malign influence activities and I think that as democracies around the world are dealing with the coronavirus pandemic and various other challenges, it is going to become even more important for us to really reflect upon how we think about these threats and its implications for strategic policy posture. I'll leave it there and look forward to talking in a bit more detail about the policy implications.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, fascinating. So Claire, we move to you.
Great, thank you very much. And I want to reiterate my thank you to RUSI and Alistair and all my fellow panelists as well. So this article that I wrote on atmospherics and reading the mood in counterterrorism examines CT, but I think it has far wider applications. I think all of us have experienced during this pandemic that sense of anxiety and uncertainty and panic, and it's been a collective shared sense of what the moment means. But at the same time, we've also experienced and felt that shared sense of support or compassion or community. And I think you see this so much in London with the Thursday Clap for Carers, with the talks of people providing help to neighbours, to helping one another out. And this sense of mood is something that's pervasive and inescapable. It's something that we really feel. And we often don't know how to articulate that and how to give that meaning. And the background to the article, and really to my interest in this work, is that I want us to try to understand, what are these emotions within society? How are people feeling? How are those feelings shared? How do they connect people? And then how do they determine how people respond to and perceive government initiatives or initiatives by those in positions of authority? And I think it touches so well with the other two articles here. And I hope that we'll be able to weave together some of those threads in the discussion afterwards. So my definition in the article is that moods are palpable but unquantifiable sense of the mood of society, atmospherics of that mood of society, informed by the tone of discourses and rooted in emotions, ideas and aspirations that are not static, but subject to change, often rapidly. And I think that sense that these are complex and they are processes. They're not a defined constant. They're something that are ever changing, they're evolving, and understanding, therefore, what it is that is promoting that change, why it is that they are evolving, and what that signifies. So really, to me, it's about finding meaning, identifying the meaning and the significance within certain moments, and reading that within society. And atmospherics are about the synchronicity between the individual experience, the collective experience, and also what that means within public spaces. For example, how do atmospherics change depending on the city you're in, whether you're in an urban area or a rural area? How does it change if you're in a government building or outside one? How does it change depending on what country you're in and what the context, the political, social context might be at that time? And I think what's so interesting is that this concept is something that's been discussed quite a bit, but has never really been conceptualized in a real way in this space that I want us to talk about more. And they're pervasive. We exist within them. They're kind of inseparable from who we are and from how we view the world. I think the sense of atmospherics we so often talk about within politics and within strategic communications, just we have this sense of how things are and what things feel like. But we need to then start to go, what are we trying to analyze? What are we trying to look at and observe? And how do we incorporate that into decision making, into strategic analysis, and into the reading of a specific moment and what it means for how they respond? And I think they matter because it's in strategic communications terms, because it's not just about what governments and communicators say, but it's about how they listen. It's how they respond and how they reflect on the tone and the tenor of society itself. And especially in the context of disinformation and misinformation and the influence of other actors within society. Why is it that certain stories are resonating more than others? Why is it that there is certain trust placed in certain stories or certain accounts or events over others? Why is it that people maybe look to certain actors over others? What are the connections that are being built? Why do certain ideas and stories have salience? What determines that? And for me, they matter because I just think emotions are so critical to how we think about human beings within society. And I really want to put emotions at the forefront of how we look at them, how we look and understand human behavior, how we observe and interpret human interaction, and the meanings that we give to our interactions and to the policies that are designed to shape society. And we often have this dichotomy between reason and emotion. We view emotion too often as irrational, as something that's unquantifiable, but actually we need to see emotions as sources of data, sources of knowledge and insight that guide the way that we view the world. And when we look at emotions, we're not looking at them as just one sole emotion. They should be understood in constellations, what Andrew Ross describes as circulations of effect. They're interwoven with one another. So you might view grief or you might view anger, but what you might also be viewing is trauma or anxiety or frustration or pride or shame. And how do they change and evolve within that space? And how does it translate into how people respond and engage and perceive how governments speak to them and how governments try to engage with them? And in the space of counterterrorism, we see this in particular with how leaders shape and contribute to moods after terrorist attacks. And I think the New Zealand Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, provided a really good example of how you can shape a mood after a traumatic and horrific event, such as the Christchurch attacks last year, by talking about unity, by talking about compassion and connection and the ability to overcome what had happened. And I think she did a very good job in that sense of reading the mood, but also being able to take it in a more constructive direction. And we've seen often in the past with terrorist attacks that we then securitize them a lot, to the point where people then maybe feel more insecure, or they start to mistrust certain communities, or they start to feel uncertain in public spaces. And obviously there are natural elements, there are natural threats and risks involved in countering terrorism, but how do you find the balance within that? How do you read that and respond? And I think they also have a key role in informing strategy. And I think the example that's in the article where you see, for example, Kissinger reading the mood of his Chinese host during his visit in 1972 to the People's Republic of China, of how are they making us feel? What is the mood they're providing? Because that is an indication of how they see us, how we should respond to them, and what it means for how far we can go in our approach towards China and our new foreign policy towards them. So emotions and atmospherics offer a way to infer meaning, to give a sense of the risks and the opportunities, and also to judge how people are engaging in their public life, engaging in the spaces that they're in and with one another. And I acknowledge that this is not an easy thing to capture. And really the aim of the article was to kind of say, how do we start to capture this more effectively? And I know that there's sentiment analysis, there's ways of measuring moods, there's polling, but I also think we need to move away from just relying so heavily on data and algorithms to try to observe this, because I think a receptivity to emotions is a very human trait. It's an emotional intelligence, it's a human intelligence. It's about receptivity, it's about sensitivity, it's about understanding the interaction between emotions and discourse and actions and behaviors. And so how do we start to interpret the stories that people are telling? Why are they telling them? Why do they matter? Why are certain emotions expressed at some times and not others? And what does that lead to? What is it unfolding consequence of certain emotions? And what about the intensity in particular? And I think that idea of intensity is really important. We have so many emotions in the background of society that are kind of latent, or they're just every day. And then you'll get an outburst of certain emotions like we're seeing now in the United States with anger and trauma and frustration at the policies and police brutality. So that then erupts into a moment where people start to talk more about things. So how do we read those shifts that are incredibly subtle? And so I think really it connects to another area I work on. It connects this idea of empathy and the importance of empathy in defining better strategy, in defining better public engagement, and being able to accept there are multiple experiences of the world and trying to understand what those are. It means as well for governments to have more self-reflection. What is it that we've done in the past that may determine how people view our actions in the present? And what does that mean? And how then do we start to talk about what those do for going forward? So to conclude, the article was not really designed to provide concrete answers. That was intentional. But I think what we see particularly at the moment is the power of moods to force change and mobilize people. And so it's really important to echo Haroro's point. For healthy democracies, that there's far greater dialogue between leaders and the people, and moods really offer that opportunity, and emotions offer that opportunity to do more, to understand how society is responding to governments and how we engage in far more of an exchange to help societies and communities feel more secure, to feel heard and to feel recognized, and then shape policies that are more constructive and citizen-centric in response. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And so I'll just kick off. Thank you. I mean, just marvelous speakers, and it was so intertwined so well, which of course Alistair edited the special edition, so thanks to him as well. But I think what strikes me very much, and it's a general question for all three of you, as a preface, I should have introduced myself. I'm Associate Professor of Peace Studies. We get a lot of students who blame everything on globalization every year. So I'm just wondering, because now there is a debate about, do all the problems we face highlight the problems with globalization? And is this linked to that, is one very broad general question. But the second question I have is really that what I draw from what you've all said is the emphasis on social trust and how that can be manipulated, or how it can be manipulated or used in a very positive way. So I suppose what I'm wondering is, underlying that, can you identify a core issue of the environment? Because Donald referred to the environments which enable myths to develop more, or that an environment that seems more conducive to myths existing. So what I'm wondering there is education a factor? Are those sorts of state level issues relevant here to this, to social trust, to democracy strength, to whether trust is manipulated? So two broad questions really for all of you. I don't know who'd like to go first. Donald?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think that's and those are very, very interesting questions. And I think in many ways that they're all connected, aren't they? And there's a tremendous irony here that although a lot of issues that are connected to or ascribed to things like globalization are very, very common, the way in which that they spread is precisely through tools of globalization, particularly in the way in which we use the internet and internet cultures spread. And I think that's connected to the point on social trust as well. And I think there's a very strong sense that we're seeing whereby our access to things like news and information more generally has changed, and by virtue of social media platforms, which are really not that old, have evolved, that we create these kind of echo chambers. And I think that is where we can see those environments of myths being spread. And I think the irony there is that if we go back to some of the literature on conspiracy theories, one of the problems that traditionally was ascribed to their spread was what a couple of authors who worked in the field, Sustain and Vermeule, have referred to as crippled epistemologies, meaning that our access to news sources is greatly limited. But with the internet, we've almost flipped that on its side completely. Our access to information sources is so great that we look for ways in which to filter that environment which is open to us. And I think online groups and cohorts help to do that for us. They create those kind of shorthands, if you like, to filter a world around us that tends to be very, very confusing. And I think there absolutely is a role for education. I think both about ways in which to filter and handle information in general, and the ways in which the internet plays a role in that sense, and there's a role for social media companies as well, which I think is obviously a very heated debate that we see taking place at the moment. But I think the points that he mentioned are all connected in ways in which it's changing very, very rapidly, which poses some pretty difficult challenges for us to respond to.
Okay, thank you. Claire?
Hi, I want to go to this idea of social trust, the second question, because I think it's so important, as you say, and I think education is important in that, in terms of trying to engage with more critical ways of examining the discourses we're experiencing, the news events. As events unfold, that there's much more critical engagement with what's happening. But I think there's also the importance within leadership, within authorities, for there to be far more integrity between what is said and what is done. And I think that trust is eroded in the misalignment of those two. And so what more can be done for there to be more transparent and accountable communications from government, from official sources that align them with what they say they will do and then what they do? Because I think that gap, people then fill that gap with other alternatives or other stories, which I think speaks to something again that Haroro was speaking about. But it's also, I think, about talking more about what it means to do politics and to do policy within the public space, to have far more understanding of the complexities of it, that there are no simple answers. And I think we often like things to be reduced to 280 characters. We want things to be accessible and bite-sized and easy. And actually a lot of the challenges that governments face are not. They're incredibly complex. There's a lot of different trade-offs and compromises. And within democracies, it's absolutely, it's automatic that there are going to be these compromises made between many different points of view. So how do we start to talk more about those different experiences, the different options, and why certain options are chosen over others, rather than kind of this soundbite politics that's a little bit reductionist? Let's actually talk about the difficulties that are faced and how we then navigate these challenging situations that we face.
Okay, thank you. So, Haroro?
I hope that I'm sure what I'm going to say now is going to kind of complement what Donald and Claire have been saying. And because I naturally kind of go towards when we think about globalization and we're talking about this social trust and yeah, exactly. I mean, they're intimately related given the topic for today. And my focus is on this idea of the effects of globalization. The effects that globalization have had on human beings. What we've tended to see is this increase in the sense of uncertainty, for a whole variety of different reasons, identity reasons, existential reasons. And this sense of uncertainty, the sense that as the world is changing rapidly, not just globally, but also at a local level, these local kind of dynamics, that there is this breakdown of tradition, which exacerbates that sense of uncertainty. And this is then attached to a acute awareness of others, that there are people that are kind of different. And these dynamics are actually really important. And they've been really, I think, beautifully captured by many scholars, but in particular the work of Zygmunt Bauman. And he talks about this idea of liquid modernity and these wars of recognition that are emerging as a consequence of these forces of globalization. And what these forces of globalization are doing, because of their effects in terms of uncertainty and breakdown of tradition and greater awareness of others, is that we're in a constant state of flux. And what he had kind of predicted and spoken, and he kind of had published about, was this idea that in response to these forces of globalization, people were going to push back and try to protect, build fortresses around their identities. And that's where this term, those wars of recognition, concerns I think that scholars of kind of social trust have had, is the impact that that globalization has, these forces that we're all talking about here, have on social trust. Now, social trust has been described as like the black matter of human kind of social and economic and political life, that you can predict so much by kind of measures of social trust. And because they are so telling about the health of a kind of a society. And there are different types of social trust as well, which we don't necessarily need to go into, but they are interesting to think about, the way, and social capital as well, but the way that social trust works, not just across groups, kind of horizontally, but also vertically, but within groups as well. And when we look at different kind of trends in these different types of social trust, it becomes a predictor for social kind of problems, where social trust between different groups is weak, but it's strong within the group. You tend to see things like nepotism and kind of corruption and these types of things within the society. So social trust becomes really important. And understanding the impact that the forces of globalization have on social trust are really significant. Now, I'm sure for many people out there, this is quite an abstract kind of discussion, but it has fundamental implications for strategic policy. And let's get straight to the point, I think. And it's that democracy as a system of government creates the space. It demands that carving out that space through those promises of freedoms, the nature of kind of consensual government for human beings to pursue, for example, what Viktor Frankl would describe as, the search for meaning. And it becomes a way in which people can, not just the individual identities, but their collective identities as well. And democracy as a system of government and the adherence to those kind of these core important principles are designed to create those spaces. Where I think that democracy has tended to fail, democracies around the world have failed, is communicating not just to the world, but to their own populations about those principles. Democracy needs to do a much better job of actually explaining democracy, that with freedoms come responsibility. Those are protected, but there are also these responsibilities. There has to be respect for other people's freedoms. Understanding what it actually means to have free and fair elections. It sounds so simple, it sounds so cliched, but the implications are profound, because you can't have free and fair elections without freedom of association, of religion, and of the press. And there's a whole range of the things that are associated with this. And so I think that perhaps there's this fundamental issue. Really, the way that democracies have communicated with themselves, with their own population.
Thank you. So that actually leads me in a bit to the next question, which is for Donald from the audience, which is about whether all of this, the question is, really reveals a need for people to have a higher purpose. So what I was thinking actually when Haroro was talking about democracy failing to communicate, that there's just something missing, that people take for granted what it is, but don't really understand its own higher purpose nearly, and don't realize its importance in some ways. So the question is the problem that people need a higher purpose, and conspiracy theories provide that for them?
Sure. I mean, I think that's a good point, and I think it comes back to this issue that in times of crisis we see a rise in support for different types of conspiracy theories. In that sense, it is a coping mechanism, but it's also no doubt a way out for those who are looking for a sense of purpose in that sense as well. So I think that makes sense. But I think I think we can be fairly clear that people approach conspiracy theories for fairly negative reasons. I mean, that's what the literature mostly tells us. So, and I think that's an interesting point, because that's less of a push factor, but more of a pull factor, if you like, that there's a different way of looking at these things, which is that there's also something very satisfying about them, irrespective of what's going on around you. So I think, yes, that sense of higher purpose as well, that is associated to how we sometimes look at conspiracy theories. It's interesting to see increasingly the language of kind of almost neo-religious movements being used in relation to conspiracy theories. And I think that sort of environment suggests that gives a good sense of higher purpose as well, if that's how they're being framed, not only by outsiders who are describing things like QAnon and so on, but also in some cases by these kind of entrepreneurs of conspiracy theories as well, who quite like to see themselves in that light as well. So if we're thinking about a higher purpose in complex, challenging, and often quite scary times, I think looking at them through that sort of prism as well might be quite helpful as well.
Thank you. So question for Claire, more methodological perhaps, but what are the indicators that should be developed to judge the emotional mood of a political community? And how should they be chosen, tested, and measured? I'm not sure, can you deal with all of that, but some of it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's something that I do struggle with, because I think good strategic communicators seem to have an intuitive sense of mood. They have a sense of how things very subtly shift. And I think people who are connected to their constituencies, to whether that's kind of at a national or a local level, tend to have a sense of what is changing. I think in terms of indicators and measurements, there's some really interesting stuff being done by YouGov that's polling emotions in a kind of weekly basis at the moment, that I think is quite interesting in terms of attempting to capture some of this data and attempting to understand, is Britain feeling happier right now? Is it feeling anxious? Is it frustrated? What does that mean for how the lockdown is being experienced? But I think it's also about, for me, the indicators involves going out and talking to people far more and talking to communities far more and really trying to understand, how do people feel within their communities and within society? How is it that they are experiencing what is going on and what is emerging as a common theme within those discourses? And I'm a qualitative researcher because I think a huge amount of how humans interact is about where we give meaning to and what we interpret as important to our daily lives, to give that meaning, to give a sense of belonging or a sense of self or a sense of community. So my indicators would really be about collecting stories, collecting the way in which people talk about the world around them, the way they talk about government policy or talk about events. How are they talking about their experience of coronavirus, for example? What does that say about where they feel more insecure and where actually they're quite content with having found more time for family and friends or found more time for being at home? What does that mean then for going forward? So it's not, I'm afraid it's one of those kind of quite blurred answers that is not definitive, but I think we need to be able to embrace these methods more, talk about emotions, talk about feelings, try to look at how they change, and really look at understanding meaning and where meaning is attributed.
Okay, thank you. So question for Haroro, sorry, I got it wrong again. A question on fact checking. So it's a little bit similar. It's on empirically looking at what's happening. For example, during election period, does fact checking services, do they have any impact on the spread of misinformation? It's quite specific, maybe, that question.
Sorry, your sound cut out.
Oh, did it? Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Fact checking.
Can you hear me now?
You asked
can everyone else hear me? Or yeah, everyone, you can hear me?
Yep.
Okay. It was just on fact checking services during, say, an election campaign. The question from the audience is, does that have any impact on misinformation? You know, sure. Not happening, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that fact-checking services are really important. I mean, what I don't like to see is a defensive kind of posture, and a defensive posture usually means a reactive posture. I think it's really important, yes, for there to be fact-checking, but that needs to be part of a much larger, not just defensive kind of counter effort, but a proactive effort. And this is absolutely kind of possible when you are, for example, preparing for elections, when you're preparing for an event, there is opportunities there for kind of planning for better coordination. You know, in the paper, I talk about different types of coordination that are necessary across the interagency, but also with multi-sector partners. So the kind of the practical coordination, strategic coordination, and communicative coordination. And so I think that where I think a lot of the influence efforts have tended to have kind of failed, frankly, during the so-called wars on terror. Well, there are some fundamental issues with how the threat was understood were a big problem. But I think even beyond that, there was this defensive, tentative, counter-messaging kind of approach, which I think is, which I actually think is problematic, and particularly in the lead up to an election where there can just be this tsunami of malign influence activities. you've got to get ahead of this. And the way that you get ahead of it is proactive, preparatory kind of messaging, tapping into the kind of atmospherics that Claire is talking about, acknowledging when certain conspiracy theories and ideas seem to be getting traction. So you make a decision about what you do address and what you kind of the keeper. And so I think that's a part of that's a part of this. That fact checking is really only, it needs to be part of a much larger spectrum of activities that are both defensive and proactive.
Thank you. There's one more question which relates slightly to that, actually. It's the last one that's come to me through the Q&A, but someone's backed it up, so it seems to be a popular-ish opinion. Just on mainstream media, do you deal with that? Because the question really seems to be, you know, that good reporters do fact check, that it's not all viral stuff that people are taking in. And does that come into your research in terms of all the things we've talked about, conspiracy theories, the emotions of a place, trust? Whoever wants to start, Donald, maybe.
I'm happy to do that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Haroro, yeah, thank you.
So yeah, it's certainly it's something which this paper does touch upon. I think that that perhaps one of the really important initiatives that we could start to kind of think about and prepare for is there's been this tendency to say, well, the way that we deal with these malign influence efforts is that we've got to improve critical thinking in the population and we've got to improve media literacy. And so, you know, these kind of foreign affairs departments will kind of put out tenders for companies and perhaps even for their own staff to kind of engage in kind of this media literacy training, which I do think is important. But what I think is at least equally important, and suppose I would argue this, is for there to be an understanding of the strategic logic that underpins these types of activities. What you actually want is, doesn't matter whether it's civil society, whether it's the media, private sector, public sector actors that are involved in this space, you actually want for them to be able to see certain activities, whether it's online or in communities or even in the media, and kind of not just look at the surface level, but try to understand, well, what is the logic of that? What is that activity actually trying to achieve? And I think it's increasing that strategic literacy in actors that is going to be really important. You know, so many conspiracy theorists that I've had the displeasure of speaking to have tended to, they think that it's all of us who, the conformists, that aren't kind of opening up our critical thinking. And so I think that getting that strategic literacy out there, giving people the tools to understand the threat and then help others to understand the threat and its dynamics are perhaps even more important.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah, Claire.
Yeah, I think this point about media is critical. It's absolutely key to the mood. It didn't feature very prominently in my article, largely because of space, but it is deserving of far more attention, because I think the media performs multiple roles within society, one of which is this kind of conduit between people's stories and sharing that with the public and sharing that with government. And I think the media in particular is important for how it captures stories, how it visualizes them as well. You know, the power of imagery, the power of a good photograph to really encapsulate the public mood is critical, as is the ability of journalists to go and speak to people. In many ways, they can do that in a way that maybe policymakers can't, in a way that politicians maybe can't always do at the extent that they do. I think one of the problems sometimes is that often the story becomes led by what sells or what is popular, rather than necessarily capturing what may be quite a more mundane or more everyday experience. So it's finding that balance, because I think some of the media coverage of terrorist attacks becomes about following certain lines that are most sensational. So good reporting should really give a much more rich, nuanced a complex account of what's really going on. What is being experienced? What are the motivations? Why did it happen? What does this mean for policy, for politics, for society? So understanding that interaction is key, and it is missing in my own article, but it's something that does need to be given far more attention, because they are able to capture and visualize that mood in a way that I think few other outlets can. And I would add to that as well social media, which I think, just look at Twitter during any kind of crisis or terrorist attack, and that really just kind of comes alive with opinion and accounts of what's happening at a very, very local level.
Okay, thank you. We've got 3 minutes left, I think so, and I've one question which I'd like to end with, but unless Donald wants to say something about the media, mainstream.
I guess very, very quickly about mainstream media is that it comes at the heart of one very significant element of conspiracy theories, which is this thing of interconnectedness. And there's this tendency now increasingly to see mainstream media as this sort of cohesive entity, and that's wrapped into conspiracy theories, forming a very effective narrative. And we see that through the way in which extremist groups rely on conspiracy theories in their communication as well, that it is seeing, first of all, mainstream media as a cohesive entity, and second of all, as an extension of state power in many ways. So, I mean, Al-Qaeda is very often referred to things like the BBC as an extension of British intelligence, for example. So I think it's very important, as we're thinking about these things, first of all, to recognize how mainstream media forms a very strong part of how conspiracy theories are talked about, but also that they don't constitute cohesive entities with kind of unified agency. So that's just a very, very quick point.
Okay, thank you. So the last question, I don't know, can we end on an optimistic note or not about all this, but it's on Western democracies. What makes them resilient? And I don't think we can go in, the question is plural, what characteristics of Western democracies make them resistant or vulnerable to conspiracy theories? I wondered if each of you could just come up with one, what you think is the key, if that's not too unacademic, one main characteristic, because we've only got 1 minute left to end on, that would make Western democracies resistant or vulnerable. So which is the factor that will stop them being vulnerable, I suppose? Or maybe very quickly, 2 or 3, if you can say it quickly. So perhaps Claire?
Yeah, very quickly off the top of my head, I think dialogue is critical to democracy. Democracy is about people living together and engaging in dialogue and creating a space for tolerance, inclusivity, and diversity in that dialogue.
Okay, thank you. And you did mention that too very much. So, thank you. Haroro?
I'd encourage people to read the work of Larry Diamond, who goes into a lot of detail with this. The Journal of Democracy is a fantastic source. In terms of one, a supportive international environment, having the democracies around the world not only protecting and championing democracy at home, but doing so overseas is a crucial factor in increasing resiliencies in democracies overall.
Yeah. Thank you. Donald?
I think just picking on those two points already mentioned, particularly in relation to dialogue, to do that on local and regional levels as well, rather than having this kind of sense that it is holistic and overarching, but to make sure that it reaches different communities as well at a local level. Okay,
well, thank you all very much. I have found it fascinating. I'm sure the audience has out there. Thank you for your time and analysis and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.